The silence of a valley at dawn is supposed to be heavy, but for Elias Thorne, it was hollow. Elias wasn't a man given to superstition, but as his tractor blade hit something that sounded less like granite and more like a splintering secret, he felt a cold chill trace the line of his spine. It was 5:15 a.m. The dew was still thick enough to soak through his boots, and the mist clung to the rolling hills of Oakhaven County like a shroud. He killed the engine, the sudden absence of the diesel rumble leaving a ringing in his ears. He stepped down, his knees popping, a reminder of 60 years of working land that didn't always want to be worked. He walked to the furrow where the metal had caught. The soil here was dark, rich, and notoriously difficult to till, but it was behaving strangely. Beneath the layer of churned earth, he saw the corner of something that wasn't limestone. It was charred wood, reinforced with a rusted, industrial-grade steel bracket. Elias wiped his hands on his denim trousers and knelt. He knew every inch of this acreage. His father had farmed it, and his grandfather before him. There was no structure documented on the county tax maps for this section of the North Pasture. He began to dig with his bare hands, the wet dirt turning his fingernails black, until he brushed away enough earth to see the edge of a heavy-duty storage locker, long since disintegrated, housing the remnants of what looked like private administrative files. Then, he saw the badge. It was pinned to a fragment of fabric, a standard-issue sheriff's star, oxidized to the color of a bruise. It belonged to the 1998 series, a model long retired. Sheriff Miller had been in power since 1995. Elias sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. He remembered the summer of '98. It was the year the highway expansion project was abandoned, the year the town's primary industrial employer shuttered, and the year the missing funds scandal broke, leaving a dozen local families without their pensions. Miller had led the investigation, claiming the records were lost in a basement flood. Looking at the charred remains beneath his tractor, Elias realized the flood hadn't been a natural disaster, it had been an internal combustion. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a subpoena from the earth itself. Elias knew the town's political ecosystem well enough to understand that what lay under his pasture was the physical proof of a systemic betrayal. He reached into his pocket for his phone, but his thumb hovered over the screen. Who do you call when the man who owns the badge is the one who buried the truth? The protocol for evidence is clear: secure the scene and contact the State Bureau of Investigation. But in Oakhaven, the state police were miles away, and their local liaison was Miller's brother-in-law. Elias stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. He didn't call the police. Instead, he pulled a tarp from his truck, covered the hole, and drove toward town. He wasn't going to be a victim, he was going to be an architect of an investigation. He needed to understand the procedural gaps he could exploit before Miller realized the ground was talking. Elias pulled into the parking lot of the Oakhaven Public Library, not the sheriff's office. He wasn't a fool, he knew the chain of custody started with documentation, not confrontation. Inside, the library was quiet, a stark contrast to the churning anxiety in his chest. He headed straight for the microfiche archives. He needed the 1998 county budget reports and the press releases regarding the pension fund collapse. If he was going to challenge the sheriff, he needed to understand the mechanics of how the original disappearance of the records had been legally framed. He spent 4 hours scrolling through grainy images. The 1998 investigation had been closed within 3 weeks. Sheriff Miller had cited unforeseeable administrative oversight and a catastrophic failure of the digital server backup. The legal language was precise, designed to insulate the office from liability by shifting blame onto a third-party IT contractor who had conveniently gone out of business 6 months later. It was a textbook case of municipal gaslighting. The records weren't lost, they were curated. Elias printed copies of the sheriff's official statements and compared them against the dated property deeds he kept in his own safe at home. The discrepancy was immediate. The land where he'd found the locker was marked as restricted utility easement since 1999, a designation that required a board vote and public notice. Elias went back to the archives. No such vote existed in the public record. The sheriff hadn't just buried files, He had utilized eminent domain laws to effectively seize private land for clandestine storage without a single signature from the county commissioners. He realized then that he couldn't just go to the police, he had to build a case that would force a state-level audit. He needed to prove that the sheriff's office had operated outside the bounds of the Administrative Procedure Act. Elias spent the afternoon drafting a formal request for information, RFI, under the state's Freedom of Information laws, targeting the chain of command records for the 1998 department. He knew the sheriff would deny it, but that denial would be a public record of obstruction. As he left the library, the sun was beginning to dip behind the tree line. His truck was parked under a security camera, and for the first time, he wondered if he was being watched. He didn't head home. He drove to the neighboring county's clerk of court office, a neutral territory. He needed to file an affidavit of discovery, a legal mechanism to put the find on the record before it could be cleaned up. He walked into the clerk's office, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. He placed his statement on the counter, detailing the location of the cache and the immediate threat of evidence spoilage. "I need this time-stamped," Elias said to the clerk. The clerk looked at the document, then back at Elias, her expression shifting from boredom to professional concern as she read the name, Sheriff Miller. "This involves a local office, Mr. Thorne. You're aware that this will trigger an automatic notification to their legal counsel once it's filed." "That's exactly why I'm here," Elias replied. He knew the moment the electronic filing pinged on the Oakhaven server, the clock would start ticking. He wasn't just digging up dirt anymore, he was officially initiating a process that Miller couldn't simply bury. By filing in a different jurisdiction, he had effectively invoked a conflict of interest clause that would make it nearly impossible for the Oakhaven Sheriff's Office to claim authority over the investigation. He was turning the bureaucratic machine against its master. As he walked out into the cool evening air, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He didn't answer, but he knew the game had officially changed. The silence of the valley was gone, replaced by the humming tension of a legal trap being set. The following morning, the atmosphere in Oakhaven felt brittle. Elias didn't go back to the pasture, he knew it was already compromised. Instead, he met with Sarah Jenkins, a former deputy who had been pushed out of the department 3 years prior for insubordination, which, in reality, was her refusal to sign off on falsified overtime reports. They sat in the back of a diner in the next county over, the kind of place where locals didn't ask questions. "You're playing a dangerous game, Elias," Sarah said, stirring her coffee. She wasn't just being cynical, she was being tactical. "Miller doesn't just manage the law here, he manages the local economy. If you push the audit, you're not just threatening his job. You're not just threatening his job. You're threatening the pensions of every retiree who had their money managed through the county-sanctioned investment firm that Miller's wife happens to own. It's an ecosystem of complicity." Elias slid the printed documents across the table. "I'm not looking for a fight with the whole town, Sarah. I'm looking for the fracture point. If he's using unauthorized land for storage, there has to be a physical paper trail of access, maintenance, or at least a logistics report that shows how he moved that volume of material without a budget entry." Sarah studied the papers, her eyes narrowing. "You're looking for ghost labor. In 1998, there was a series of unexplained equipment rentals for road maintenance that never actually occurred. If you can cross-reference the invoice numbers from those rentals with the dates of the files you found, you can prove the office used public funds to build the bunker. But Miller won't just ignore this. He'll frame your discovery as a criminal trespass. He'll say you planted the evidence to settle a long-standing land dispute." Elias realized she was right. Miller's primary defense would be to discredit the integrity of the evidence. He needed a way to verify the items before the sheriff's department could touch them. "I need an independent forensic examiner, Sarah. Someone with no ties to the regional system." "There's a private firm in the city that handles environmental assessment," she suggested. "They do soil contamination reports for corporate disputes. They don't care about local politics, but they do care about chain of custody. If they dig it up, it's a professional record. But you'll need a court order to authorize the site survey." Elias felt the weight of the strategy. It was a race against a man who held all the local levers. He had to secure the legal authorization before Miller could secure the scene. "I'll file the motion tomorrow," Elias said. "But I need you to go to the sheriff's office. Not as a cop, but as a concerned citizen asking about the status of the 1998 highway records. See if they're still using the same flood excuse, or if they've changed their script." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. The risk was immense, but she knew the internal rot of the office better than anyone. As she left, Elias looked at the map of his property. He was essentially conducting a one-man investigation against a municipal power structure. He understood now that the sheriff's power was built on the assumption that nobody would ever do the math. By linking the property misuse to the 1998 financial collapse, Elias was creating a narrative that was impossible for the county board to ignore without appearing complicit themselves. Later that afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice was strained. "Miller knows something is happening. He didn't answer my questions, but he's already filed an injunction to prohibit unauthorized activity on your property, citing environmental hazard. He's trying to use the law to lock you out of your own land under the guise of public safety." Elias stood up, walking to the window. The trap was closing, but the injunction was an admission of guilt. He had successfully forced Miller to reveal his hand. The sheriff was no longer just the law, he was now a litigant fighting to keep the ground closed. Elias knew he had to act fast. He needed to reach out to the state prosecutor directly, presenting the injunction as a deliberate attempt to obstruct a potential criminal investigation. The chessboard was set. The injunction arrived at Elias's home via process server just before dusk, a heavy envelope that felt like a death warrant for his privacy. The language was suffocatingly formal, citing unstable subterranean conditions and potential toxic exposure as reasons to prohibit any excavation on his northern acreage. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic obstruction, designed to turn a criminal discovery into a civil safety dispute. By framing the site as a health hazard, Miller had successfully bypassed the sheriff's department's own jurisdiction, effectively placing the land under the control of the county environmental board, an entity whose board members were, without exception, political appointees of the sheriff's long-term allies. Elias sat at his kitchen table, the injunction spread out before him like a map of a battlefield. He realized that Miller had made a tactical error. He had reacted with extreme, overspecified legal force. A simple denial would have been easier to manage, but this injunction was an overt attempt to restrict access to a site Miller hadn't even officially investigated. Elias called Sarah. "He's playing for time," Elias said, his voice hard. "He's betting that if he can stall for 30 days, the environmental board will mandate a containment procedure, which will give him legal cover to bulldoze the entire site under the guise of site remediation." "He's already moving," Sarah replied, her tone urgent. "I've been monitoring the county supply logs. They've requisitioned 2 heavy-duty landfill liners and a commercial-grade backhoe for unspecified maintenance on the north end of the county. He isn't going to seal the site, he's going to excavate it himself and dispose of the contents." The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The legal fight was a diversion. The physical destruction of evidence was the primary objective. He needed to create an intervention, and he needed it to be public enough that Miller couldn't act without being seen. Elias grabbed his laptop. He wasn't just a farmer anymore, he was a whistleblower who had to go viral to stay alive. He began drafting a detailed summary of the 1998 pension collapse, the missing records, and the sudden, unexplained, environmental injunction. He didn't just target the local papers, he went straight to the state-level investigative journalists and the regional offices of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. He attached a copy of the injunction, highlighting the blatant conflict of interest regarding the board members. He framed it as a cover-up in progress, using the documents he'd retrieved from the library to show the correlation between the 1998 events and the present-day legal maneuverings. It was a narrative of corruption so clear that even a cursory review would force a pause in any official action. "I'm hitting send," Elias whispered to the empty room. Within an hour, the consequences were immediate. A journalist from a major regional outlet reached out, his questions sharp and professional. He didn't ask if the claim was true, he asked for the evidence to support the allegation of municipal malfeasance. Elias provided it all: the digital photos of the charred locker, the timeline of the 1998 budget, and the copy of the new, suspicious injunction. The pressure began to build. By midday, the sheriff's office was flooded with calls from the regional press and, more importantly, the state's attorney general's office. The environmental hazard excuse was rapidly losing its utility under the glare of public scrutiny. Miller was no longer the hunter, he was the subject of an unfolding scandal. But Miller was a survivor. He doubled down. He sent patrol cars to sit at the edge of Elias's property line, not to enforce the law, but to intimidate. They sat there for hours, engines idling, lights pulsing, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the law was watching. Elias stayed inside, the curtains drawn, his eyes fixed on the driveway. He knew that for Miller, this was no longer about the money from 1998. It was about the survival of his reputation. The conflict had escalated from a quiet discovery in the dirt to a full-scale institutional war, and Elias was standing in the crosshairs. He knew the next move would be a physical attempt to force a resolution before the state auditors could arrive. He had to hold his ground, but the walls were closing in. The final confrontation did not arrive with a bang, but with the cold, bureaucratic click of a state trooper's radio. By 8 a.m. on the third day of the siege, the state police, acting on an emergency order from the Attorney General's office, had established a perimeter around the North Pasture. Miller's patrol cars were ordered to withdraw, their officers forced to stand by as passive observers while a specialized team of state-appointed forensic investigators moved onto the land. Elias stood on his porch, watching as the team deployed ground-penetrating radar. He was exhausted, his nerves frayed by 72 hours of sleeplessness and the relentless pressure of the sheriff's intimidation tactics, but he felt a strange sense of clarity. The truth, which had been buried beneath layers of soil and decades of orchestrated silence, was about to be rendered into evidence. Miller was there, standing near his SUV at the edge of the property, watching the machines. He looked older, his posture slumped, the bluster replaced by the hollow expression of a man who realized he had run out of procedural maneuvers. The radar didn't lie. Within an hour, the team identified the primary site of the cache. They didn't just find one locker, they found an entire subterranean network of archival containers, systematically placed to mimic utility drainage. As the backhoe began to carefully strip away the topsoil under the direction of the forensic team, the first metal casing emerged from the earth. It was identical to the one Elias had found, charred, rusted, but largely intact. The state prosecutor approached Elias on the porch. He didn't offer congratulations, he offered a grim acknowledgement of the facts. "This is a significant find, Mr. Thorne. These records contain the original pension fund ledger entries, the cancelled checks, and the correspondence between the sheriff's office and the defunct investment firm. This isn't just an administrative error. This is documented embezzlement on a massive, organized scale." Miller didn't fight the arrest. As the handcuffs were applied, the silence of the valley finally returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret kept, it was the quiet of a community being forced to reckon with the reality of its own governance. The scandal that had been buried in 1998 was finally exhumed, and with it, the entire framework of Miller's local control began to disintegrate. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was comprehensive. The Oakhaven Sheriff's Office was placed under state receivership. The pension funds were traced through the recovered ledger, leading to the identification of hidden accounts in several regional banks. The legal proceedings were long and tedious, a process of forensic accounting and grand jury testimonies, but the core of the case held firm. Elias, the farmer who had simply wanted to work his land, found himself in the position of the primary witness, his discovery serving as the catalyst for a systemic cleaning of a corrupt municipal house. The final, ironic truth of the case was that Miller had actually built a bunker on a portion of the land he thought he had seized legally, only to have the county tax records prove that the parcel remained in Elias's family estate. His attempt to use public utility laws to secure his cache of secrets had effectively anchored the evidence on land he didn't control, providing the exact legal pivot Elias needed to force the investigation. As the sun set over the pasture, now scarred by trenches and marked by police tape, Elias walked out to the edge of the field. The land was messy, torn up, and required years of restoration, but it was his. He looked down at the empty space where the files had been, and then back toward the town. The truth had indeed been buried, but in a world built on paper promises and digital manipulation, the simple, stubborn reality of the earth had provided the final, undeniable verdict. The old farmer had not just dug up a box of charred paper, he had unearthed the integrity of a town. He turned back toward his home, the weight of the last few months finally lifting from his shoulders. He was ready to start planting again, but this time, in soil where nothing was hidden. The secret was gone, the sheriff was gone, and the valley was, for the first time in his life, truly quiet.